August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht Headquarters, East Prussia. General Alfred Jodl analyzed with slight disdain the reports coming from the Western Front. The American advance, though rapid, was for him a predictable and fleeting spectacle. He knew what every German officer knew. You don't win a war with speed, you win with fuel. And the math was against the Americans. Patton had exceeded his reach. It was more than 600 kilometers from the Normandy supply depots. No army in the world, it was believed, could sustain this distance. For Jodl, the question wasn't whether the Americans would stop, but when. That conviction, sustained by decades of military doctrine and by Germany's own experience on the Eastern Front, was about to crumble in the face of something that German logic did not foresee: a supply line created on the basis of volume, improvisation, and industrial excess, the Red Ball Express. A continuous flow of trucks operated day and night, which would turn destroyed roads into logistical veins pulsing with fuel and ammunition. This is the account of the invisible turn of the war, from the operation that proved that in the industrial age, logistics does not follow the victory. It defines who wins, and the German generals who laughed at the American improvisation were defeated by it. But before we dive into the data, there is a statistic that defines this story and already announces its outcome. For 82 consecutive days, more than 6,000 American trucks crossed France every day in an operation that transported more than 400,000 tons of supplies directly to the front line. At the head of these vehicles were 23,000 drivers, 3/4 of them African American, operating under exhaustion, fog, risk, and improvisation. What seemed like logistical chaos became the arithmetic nightmare of the German high command. What the generals called waste became efficiency by volume, and what they despised as unfeasible was imposed as inevitable. If you value real history, the numbers that changed the course of the war and the effort to rescue forgotten truths, leave your like and subscribe. This helps this channel to continue revealing what arrogance ignored until it was crushed by a column of trucks. In July 1944, while the beaches of Normandy were still teeming with landings and American tanks were breaching the hedges of rural France, the German High Command was putting together its predictions based on an unshakable doctrinal principle: no mechanized army can exceed its own supply capacity. To men like Guderian, Rundstedt, and Model, veterans of Europe's most brutal campaigns, this was more than an assumption. It was a law of war. In Russia, they had watched the blitzkrieg itself die of thirst in the Soviet mud. Tanks stopped, engines frozen, entire divisions immobilized due to lack of fuel or spare parts. That scenario, they believed, would now be repeated with the Americans. Patton, impetuous and swift, was advancing too fast. In a matter of days, his forces would be more than 600 kilometers from Allied ports. The roads were destroyed, the tracks dynamited, the logistics centers razed by the retreating Wehrmacht itself. For the Germans, it was inevitable. The American advance would be self-destructive. The predictions, recorded in intelligence memos and operational dispatches, nailed with arrogant accuracy. The Third Army would stop in 48 hours. The estimate wasn't emotional. It was arithmetic. A single Sherman tank consumed on average half a gallon of fuel per mile driven on the road. Crossing fields, this number tripled. An American armored division needed approximately 1,000 tons of supplies per day, including ammunition, fuel, parts, and rations. Multiplied by the 12 divisions under Patton's command, one arrived at the terrifying figure of 12,000 tons per day, and according to the Germans, no force on the planet was capable of transporting this volume for more than 500 kilometers uninterrupted, daily, in an ongoing war. This was the conviction of the German General Staff. Physics would win over bravado. American logistics, they said, was an illusion wrapped in flashy paint. The error was not in the equation, it was in the assumption. The Germans started from the premise that the enemy operated under the same logistical, industrial, and doctrinal limitations as the European armies. And that's exactly where they went wrong. The American machine did not think in terms of conservation, but of replacement. It did not operate according to scarcity, but by redundancy. The Germans, when they saw a damaged truck, spoke of repair. The Americans spoke of replacement. Where the Germans rationed fuel, the Americans set up distribution systems that used gasoline to transport gasoline. What for the Wehrmacht generals was waste, for the Allied logistical command was strategy. an invisible and lethal philosophical difference. In Berlin, German intelligence agencies estimated that the United States could mobilize about 50,000 heavy vehicles during the entire European campaign. The real number was 7 times higher. The GMC CCKW 21-2-ton truck alone, nicknamed the Duke and a Half, had more than 500,000 units produced during the war. For comparison, it was more trucks than all the military vehicles of all types combined that Germany had produced since 1939. The American supply chain wasn't a line. It was an industrial conveyor belt that started in Detroit and ended in the ruins of newly liberated French cities. In factories that operated 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, the average time between the manufacture of a new truck and its landing in Europe was only 22 days. The Germans couldn't even imagine such a fast system, and they didn't even try to intercept it. And here comes the fact that the Germans simply ignored or refused to believe. American production of military trucks was, in 1944, 10 times greater than Germany's entire automotive industrial capacity. 10 times. If this number impresses you, comment below, logistics wins. Because for the German generals this was an invisible fact, until the moment they heard it coming on the roads night and day. This strategic blindness was fueled by a doctrine rooted in tactical genius and operational sophistication, but paralyzed in the face of raw volume. The Germans knew how to maneuver divisions with surgical precision. They knew how to organize breakthrough offensives, encircle entire armies, dismantle states with 15 days of coordinated attack. But they did not know how to replenish these feats with constant speed. The Wehrmacht, until 1944, still operated with 80% of its logistics transport based on animal traction. When his tanks advanced faster than the wagons could follow, the front stopped. And it was exactly this limitation, inherited from the 19th century, that they projected onto Americans. What the Germans did not understand is that the Americans had industrialized until the war itself. This doctrinal difference begins to manifest itself in field reports in August. Panzer units on the Western Front record, the Americans are advancing too fast to keep up with this pace. Logistical collapse is expected soon. But the days go by. The trains continue. The American lines are not only maintained, but deepened. The units that should have stopped accelerate. Consumption increases. And the supply accompanies. What was once arrogance becomes discomfort. What was certainty becomes doubt. What seemed to be a tactical error turns out to be a new doctrine. A commander of the 116th Panzer, in an elevated position in the Normandy Hills, writes on August 25th, "Constant movement of American vehicles is observed, uninterrupted. There is no spacing between trains. There is no blackout discipline. They do not hide. They do not fear us." The phrase echoes like a harbinger. The enemy did not behave like an army. It behaved like a system. The Germans had prepared everything to defeat tanks, not to engage trucks. The blitzkrieg that once terrorized Europe was being won by the logistical blitz of the Red Ball Express. And yet this was still just the beginning, because what the Germans didn't yet know was that starting the following week, 23,000 drivers would go into action in a continuous cycle, transporting more than 12,000 tons a day directly to Patton's tanks. And among these men were those whom Nazi racial doctrine did not even consider soldiers. The impact of this ideological confrontation between a civilization that bet on purity and another that bet on production was yet to come. To the German generals, everything seemed like déjà vu, an enemy advancing too fast, relying too much, breaking through lines ahead of schedule, only to be stopped by its own grasp. The picture was clear: mud, destroyed roads, columns stranded in the middle of nowhere. This is how the Red Army stopped the Wehrmacht in 1941. And now they believed France would repeat the script. But there was a fatal error in this reading. France was not Russia, not in geography, not in infrastructure, not in scale. And above all, it wasn't the same kind of war. The French terrain, instead of holding back the Americans, became an advantage. Not because of the ideal conditions, they didn't exist, but because of the way the United States decided to face them. Where the Germans saw destroyed roads, Allied engineers saw direct lines of advance. Many French highways, although damaged by the fighting, maintained the straight and direct layout typical of the road network of the 19th century. More importantly, France's urban fragmentation, hundreds of villages and small towns scattered along the way, has created a makeshift ecosystem of logistical hubs. Each city taken was transformed in a matter of hours into an outpost for supply, repair, or transshipment. Bakeries became ammunition depots. Churches housed motor workshops. Cobblestone streets were washed up and turned into truck lanes. The country was not only liberated, it was converted into a logistics platform. Meanwhile, the combat engineers of the United States Army operated as an invisible but absolutely decisive force. Every bridge blown up by the German rear was rebuilt in less than 24 hours. In many cases, Americans didn't even expect it. They built parallel wooden bridges, created temporary detours, or crossed paths with improvised amphibious passages. The idea that the destruction of French infrastructure would slow down the Allies proved to be a strategic misconception. On the contrary, it forced Americans to think off the rails. Literally, Germany, accustomed to depending on the rail network to fuel its offensives, saw in the collapse of French trains an efficient tactic of denial. But the United States came from an automobile culture. The absence of trains was not an obstacle. It was motivation to accelerate the motorization of war. Rail transport, centralized and vulnerable to sabotage, was replaced by a pulverized logic of thousands of smaller vehicles. Each truck was a wagon with its own engine. Every road, a dynamic trail. Fuel did not depend on fixed depots but on mobile lines. The destruction of European infrastructure, expected to slow the American offensive, ended up accelerating its decentralization. This contrast is even more evident in the operational choices. When the Wehrmacht retreated, it destroyed everything. Tracks, tunnels, viaducts, stations. It was the logic of scorched earth. But the Americans, free from their attachment to the railroad, prioritized asphalt and dirt routes. They created a war road doctrine, with maps redrawn by reconnaissance units, prioritizing passages for heavy vehicles. A sergeant with a board and a map reconfigured the offensive in real time. The Germans, in their rigidity, waited weeks to react to each change of terrain. The Americans improvised the next route while the current one was still in use. The very concept of the battlefront has changed. It was no longer a line, but a mobile set of logistical nodes interconnected by motorized corridors. The marching orders were accompanied by instructions for supply, maintenance, and retreat points. War is no longer linear. It has become fluid. Another critical factor was the mastery of field engineering. The combat engineering battalions, made up of more than 200,000 troops, operated as a reconstruction force concurrent with the advance. They carried mobile bridges, cranes, portable sawmills, compressors, concrete barrels, bitumen tanks. In a few hours, a rural highway was transformed into a military route with the capacity to support 10,000 vehicles a day. In a week, a city like Le Mans went from ruin to logistics center, all without waiting for orders from the high command. Logistics was decentralized by necessity and efficient by practice. Improvisation was systematized. This adaptability impressed even the British allies. Royal Army officers who followed the offensive recorded in internal reports that the American ability to create new routes and sustain motorized columns exceeds any known doctrinal standard. The praise came as a surprise. The British, closer to European doctrine, still saw precision as the basis of effectiveness. The Americans showed that, with critical mass, it was possible to replace precision with abundance and win. In practice, this meant that the American offensive, far from slowing down in the French countryside, gained momentum with each city taken. Each kilometer advanced generated new points of support. Each road cleared expanded the fleet's reach. It was the opposite of what had happened in Russia. There, the German advance died as the distance grew. Here, the American advance was fed by its own progression. The Germans were slow to notice this phenomenon. By the time they did, it was too late. Their doctrine was based on scarcity, that of the Americans in superabundance. In late August, a German general captured south of Chartres confessed, under interrogation, "We expected mud and fog, but they brought machines and fire." The phrase reveals more than astonishment. It reveals the end of a logic of war based on climate, terrain, and natural limitation. The Americans broke with this logic with oil, steel, and scale planning. But there was still one detail that the Germans did not even consider: who, in fact, was driving these trucks. Because in the coming weeks, it would be thousands of unknown drivers, operating day and night, who would keep the front line alive. Anonymous men who had no statue, no glory, and not always the same rights. but they would carry the weight of victory on their shoulders and make the war move. On the narrow roads of devastated France, between columns of tanks and clouds of dust raised by worn tires, the invisible backbone of the largest U.S. ground offensive rolled, 23,000 drivers, operating day and night in uninterrupted shifts, taking turns between the steering wheel, the deafening noise of the engines, and the absolute silence of institutional recognition. Nearly 3/4 of these men were African American soldiers, segregated by law in their own country but crucial to the machinery that would keep George S. Patton moving. Without them, the Third Army came to a standstill. With them, the front advanced with a speed that even the Allied planners had not anticipated. These drivers did not receive decorations. Few were mentioned in official dispatches, but they carried fuel, ammunition, rations, and hope on wheels daily, crossing ruined cities and minefields, with an uncertain destination and an always improvised route. They slept in their own trucks, often on sandbags with engines still hot and orders not to stop under any circumstances. A miscalculation or a flat tire could condemn an entire room to paralysis. Every minute lost was one less advance for Patton, and they knew it. The Red Ball Express operation was not just a logistical feat. It was a human achievement and a moral paradox. While liberating French cities under Nazi occupation, these men were not allowed to sit in the same wagon as their white counterparts when they returned home. They couldn't go to the same restaurants. Many could not even vote. The war they were fighting in Europe was against fascism, but the one they faced inside their own trains was against institutional racism. The units were segregated, the accommodations separated, the promotions limited. Still, these men kept the system running with almost military precision. They created their own codes, nicknames for the trucks, improvised hymns that they sang during the early hours. Some vehicles carried hand-painted names: 24-Hour Freedom, Justice Roller, No Stop. When the onboard radios failed, they slammed into the coded body plates to warn of turns, potholes, or threats. It wasn't just drivers. They were inventors of a method. The routine was brutal. They drove for 16 to 20 hours a day, with little more than dry rations and amphetamine tablets to keep their eyes open. Rest was a luxury and often a risk. Some slept while they refueled. Others changed the steering wheel among themselves, without stopping the vehicle. There was no time for ceremony, only one goal: to keep the flow. And with the flow, the war in motion. Accidents were frequent. Tires blew out. Brakes failed. Sharp turns became fatal traps. But stopping was not an option. The order was clear. If a truck broke down, the driver should go to the side of the road, signal, and wait for a maintenance vehicle to pick it up. No train could stop because of a single truck. The gear could not be interrupted. And even knowing this, these men faced each stretch as if it were the most important part of the war. Most of these drivers had never left the United States. Many had never driven outside the segregated South. Now they were crossing a foreign country, without reliable maps, under constant risk of ambushes and air attacks, driving heavy vehicles with explosive charges. But with each mile, they won not just the distance, they won a narrative constructed to ignore them. The Wehrmacht, indoctrinated by the racial ideology of the Nazi regime, did not know what to do when it found troops composed mostly of black men leading logistical convoys. A German commander captured during Nancy's offensive said, perplexed, "They put their Negroes at the head of the army. That's insane." The answer came in the form of noise, the continuous roar of the engines beating German arithmetic. Even under official silence, there was recognition within the troops. White officers on the front line knew, without the Red Ball's black drivers, the offensive stalled. Many reported to their superiors that logistics had become more important than weapons. What was once a pillar of support was now the battlefield itself, and the men who conducted the war on wheels, though invisible to the newspapers, were seen by soldiers on the front lines as essential as fighter pilots or gunners. In October, Major General Elmer W. Rogers wrote, "These drivers are not just transportation, they are the blood of the operation. If the flow stops, the body dies." This phrase, lost among hundreds of logistical reports, sums up the new logic of war. It was a war where victory did not come with gunfire, but with deliveries made on time, where heroism did not carry a rifle, but jerry cans of gasoline, where the most efficient soldier was not the one who killed the most, but the one who didn't let the tanks stop. By the end of the campaign, the Red Ball Express drivers would have traveled the equivalent of 12 full laps around the Earth. They did so with simple machines, makeshift roads, and the determination of those who knew that their task, though ignored, was decisive. And if history hesitated to recognize its role, the impact of its actions was imprinted in the statistics. The Third Army never stopped. Not for a day, not even for a kilometer, nor for lack of fuel. But what no one had yet understood was that this operation, apparently improvised and chaotic, hid behind its urgency something that the Germans had never seen: a revolutionary logistical structure. Because the Red Ball Express wasn't just willpower, it was a plan. And the plan would begin to be revealed with the emergence of a military highway that no one expected. When the traditional system began to crumble under the weight of its own advance, American logistics officials understood that keeping the flow going required something radical. It was no longer possible to rely on the classic model of distribution at multiple points and interspersed displacements. The war was moving too fast, the divisions were demanding more than anticipated, and the tracks were dead. It was in this vacuum that the campaign's boldest idea was born: a one-way military highway, created from scratch, exclusively to supply Patton. It was the birth of the Red Ball Express. The proposal seemed absurd in the eyes of the classical doctrine: a continuous line, operating 24 hours a day with vehicles separated by only 5 minutes, headlights on even at night, running with full priority over any other operation. In any other army, it would be refused. In the American, it has become the norm. The structure was simple but ingenious. 2 parallel routes, one exclusively for one way, the other only for return, allowing constant traffic without blockages. Mobile maintenance stations were positioned every 80 kilometers. Military traffic officers regulated the entrances and exits with clockwork precision. Technical patrols cleared obstacles in real time. Any village on the way was transformed into a support station. All of this was set up in less than 72 hours after the plan was approved. The name Red Ball came from the priority freight cars on American railroads and now symbolized urgency on wheels in France. What was surprising was not only the speed, but the mentality. The operation did not follow the European model of warfare based on centralized control. It was decentralized, flexible, based on the tactical autonomy of drivers and field officers. If a bridge fell, the train did not wait for orders. It diverted. If a city blocked the way, an alternative route was built, with jackhammers and shovels. The war did not stop to wait for logistics. Logistics led the way. The Red Ball Express was made up of more than 6,000 vehicles operating simultaneously, all prioritized. None of them could be delayed by civilian traffic or columns of troops. Vehicles that interfered with the flow were fined or forcibly removed. The supply chain took precedence even over the deployment of combat units. It was the tacit recognition that in that war, winning did not depend only on infantry, it depended on supply. The operations command structure also broke standards. Specialized transportation officers were given direct authority over sections of the highway. Engineering sergeants had veto power over unsafe routes. The times were timed. Every hour a convoy departed. On average, it took 18 hours to travel the 600 kilometers of the line between the ports and the front. The return took another 2 or 3 hours, with empty vehicles or bringing injured people. Drivers slept on scales, with meals scheduled by calories and schedules. Each stop had water, grease, tires, and a mechanic on duty. All this infrastructure was built on ruins, in a country collapsing, with incomplete maps and under intermittent bombardment. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Germans also had roads, they also knew the difficulty of the terrain, but they were stuck in the logic of the railroad, of centralization, of rigid hierarchy. They couldn't conceive of a system where maintenance sergeants would make critical logistical decisions. The Americans, by contrast, operated like a beehive. Each cell worked on its own, but in synchrony. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about these hidden gears of victory. And yet, even with all this sophistication, there was one outstanding issue. The speed was impressive, the volume too. But would the system resist its own success? Was it sustainable to keep thousands of trucks in continuous rotation, with exhausted men and parts wearing to the limit? That was the silent doubt among the planners. And it was then that the Red Ball Express faced its first major test. A breakthrough by Patton outside the logistical axis. An unexpected maneuver. and a new enemy, time itself. In the Wehrmacht's math, the maximum safe speed for an armored division in the field was 30 kilometers per day. Above that, the risk of logistical disruption became exponential. It was an equation that had underpinned the initial advance of the Blitzkrieg and later exposed its cracks in the Soviet steppes. But by August 1944, George S. Patton was advancing twice that, 40 miles a day, every day, for nearly 2 weeks. Its tanks consumed fuel at the limit of efficiency. Its troops stretched dangerously, and yet the Third Army did not stop. German doctrine said that this was operational suicide. For Americans, it was Tuesday. The explanation? A logistical operation that not only kept up with the pace, but fed it. In the first 7 days of the Red Ball Express, 89,000 tons of supplies were delivered. Just for context, this volume would be enough to sustain the entire invasion of Sicily for an entire month. In 82 days, the accumulated total reached 412,000 tons. And it wasn't just boxes and drums, they were lives kept moving. Each ton meant ammunition for a platoon, fuel for a tank, rations for a battalion, parts to keep the vehicles running. War was no longer measured in divisions, it was measured in ton miles. And the United States delivered 222 million of them. For the Germans, the numbers were insane. They observed, through intercepted reports and reports of retreating units, that the Americans lost about 5,000 vehicles a month in the logistical effort. And yet they continued. There was no logic in that, at least, not in European logic. Each destroyed truck was immediately replaced. Every axle broken, changed on the field. The logic of waste, which the German generals condemned, revealed itself as a logic of planned redundancy. The system was so large, so full of surpluses, that it absorbed losses as a living organism deals with small hemorrhages. The flow never ceased. On the contrary, it increased. Each week the volume grew. Each day the columns stretched out. Each night, France heard the incessant roar of engines heading toward the front. And among these numbers, one stood out as a symbol of the impossible: 700,000 gallons of gasoline a day. This was the daily consumption of the Allied offensive in the weeks following the liberation of Paris. The figure was so absurd that it forced the creation of parallel distribution systems. Barrels were dropped from planes at previously marked points. Tanker trucks crossed areas that were still unstable. In certain stretches, gasoline was delivered by mobile pumps pulled by tractors. None of these methods were conventional. None of them were in the manuals. But they all worked. And more than that, they were all foreseen. Because America's true logistical power wasn't just in quantity, it was in the predictability of chaos. Planners had assumed collapse as a constant variable. They had planned not for perfection, but for the margin of error. The system accepted failures and absorbed them. The American logistical doctrine was, in fact, the opposite of the German one. Where the Germans sought precision and absolute control, the Americans sought volume and flexibility. Where the Germans avoided losses, the Americans diluted them in scale. For the Wehrmacht, a destroyed convoy was a strategic failure. For the United States, it was statistics. This paradigm shift shocked European observers. British officers, accustomed to the scarcity of continental encirclement, viewed with astonishment the American abundance. Troops who received twice as much ammunition as necessary, hot meals served in the rear, coffee distributed in individual cans. It was more than abundance. It was a new form of warfare. But the data did not lie. The American advance that should have stopped at Le Mans continued to Metz. The offensive, which was supposed to last for days, lasted for weeks. And the German lines, waiting for the enemy to collapse, found themselves increasingly cornered. A transmission picked up by Allied listening services from a German command post in September 1944 carried a short but telling sentence: "They don't stop. They never stop." It was the tacit recognition of the breach of logic. German generals who relied on the limits of physics began to realize that the enemy had turned the impossible into routine. But what still caused the greatest perplexity in the German general staff was the absence of critical bottlenecks. How to sustain such a large system without collapsing from within? The answer lay in a sector almost ignored in the military hierarchy: maintenance. And that's exactly where the next part of the story will take place. Because while the tanks advanced and the trucks delivered, another war was being waged. Against time, dust, and wear. It was the Grease War, and it was also being defeated. For the German High Command, the war followed strict principles: economy of resources, concealment of movements, doctrinal precision. For this reason, the reports that began to arrive from the Western Front between August and September 1944 were both confusing and alarming. Field officers reported something that didn't make sense. The Americans advanced in dense logistical columns with beacons on at night, with no tactical spacing, crossing villages and open fields as if they could fear nothing. It was a frontal violation of all the rules of gate discipline. For the Germans, this was suicide. But the trains passed by and they came back, and they passed again, and they came back. Every 5 minutes, non-stop, as if darkness itself were no longer a threat, as if the Luftwaffe didn't exist, as if the enemy were not there. It was as if the Americans treated the front as a safe road, and this shook something deeper than strategy. It shook belief. In German military doctrine, night blackouts were law. Every lantern covered, every cigarette extinguished. The discipline of silence and invisibility was a legacy of the First World War, and a commandment of the Blitzkrieg. Night exposure was synonymous with vulnerability, but the Red Ball Express trains challenged that concept with disconcerting naturalness. With high beams, blaring horns, and reflective signs, American trucks didn't just run at night, they dominated the night. And this domain, previously unimaginable, became visible to the German soldiers hiding in the trees, hearing the engines before they even saw them. A sergeant of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "They pass in line, all illuminated. They do not hide. They are not afraid." The phrase dry and without judgment concealed what was already insinuating itself into German tactical thinking. The enemy had ceased to be merely numerous. He had ceased to fear. Radio intercepts reinforced this impression. Allied troops, in full operation, transmitted logistical coordinates on open frequencies without encryption. They believed that air superiority made any attempt at interception irrelevant. And for the Germans, that confidence bordered on arrogance. But the reality imposed itself. There was no possible retaliation. The planes were absent. The ambushes were too dispersed to have an impact. The artillery could no longer predict the flows. The sound of engines had replaced the sound of artillery as the main instrument of presence. And for the German troops isolated in the forests of France, this constant noise was not just a test of strength. It was a form of psychological torture. A soldier of the 352nd Infantry captured near Argentan said when questioned, "For 3 nights we only heard trucks. We didn't know if it was advance or retreat, but it didn't stop. It never stopped." The German doctrine, founded on the idea of tactical initiative, was no longer able to react. The patrols reported that the convoys followed like antlines, one after the other, in patterns that defied military logic. There was no visible relay, no standard formation. It was as if the Americans had abandoned the manual, and in the process written a new one. The ambush attempts failed. The trains were too long, too numerous, too flexible. Destroying a truck did not stop the queue. Interrupting one road caused 5 others to be opened. The doctrine of denial of territory, one of the foundations of the German resistance, did not work against an enemy that seemed to flow like water. This new type of warfare confused even intelligence officers. In Berlin, compiled reports indicated that the average American logistics consumption per division was 3 times higher than the original estimate made in 1942. But instead of slowing down, this consumption accelerated the offensive. The paradox was glaring. In the German model, excess was weakness. In the American model, excess was force. The belief that supplies should be rationed gave way to the reality that excess supplies became weapons. Ammunition was used abundantly. Gasoline with contempt. A German general arrested in September summed up the sentiment, "You burn fuel like there's no tomorrow." The American officer who heard the phrase replied only, "For you, maybe it doesn't exist." And so, as Patton's tanks advanced along the roads of the French countryside, the real terror came from behind, not from the guns, but from the trucks. Each night, as German officers waited for a cessation in traffic, the roar of the engines resumed. It was like a constant, uninterrupted presence that could not be stopped or understood. "It's as if the trucks are alive," wrote an artillery officer near Verdun. "They come out of nowhere and keep coming. They are worse than the shots." This collapse of ideological perception was not immediate, but it was irreversible. The army the Germans expected to face was not the one they found. It was not necessary. It was not elegant. It was not orthodox. But it was efficient, massive, carefree, and, the scariest thing, absolutely fearless. The constant sound of the engines became more than noise. It became a symbol of a war that the Germans no longer knew how to win, or how to understand. But the real impact of this transformation was not only on the battlefield. It began to manifest itself behind the scenes of the war, where every tire, every gallon, every spare part had to be predicted in advance, surgically. Because now, what scared was not the present. It was to realize that all this had been planned long before the first gear, and that the Americans had not yet shown the peak of what they were prepared to deliver. When the distance between Normandy's ports and the front line began to challenge the limits of efficiency, the Germans finally believed that the American advance would stop. The logic was unbeatable. With every extra mile, the trucks needed more time, more fuel, more maintenance. The flow stretched, drivers were exhausted, vehicles broke down. The Wehrmacht doctrine predicted just such a collapse. But once again, European reasoning did not keep up with the American mindset. Instead of resisting entropy, the Allies accepted it and mastered it. The Red Ball Express has been redesigned in full working order. Mobile supply units were positioned in the middle of the road. Transfer zones were created, where exhausted drivers handed over their trucks to rested new crews. Instead of waiting for parts, the workshops moved with the trains. Secondary routes, previously avoided due to risk or insecurity, have become logistical escape routes. Nothing was fixed. Everything was adaptable. Each road became a possibility, each bottleneck a turning point, each delay a tactical laboratory. The elasticity was such that vehicles captured from the Germans were quickly incorporated into the system. French civilian buses were converted into ammunition transports. Italian trucks, previously abandoned, returned to service under new paint and new function. It was logistics as a living organism, mutable, reactive, aggressive. American supply officers operated as emergency engineers. Instead of waiting for orders, they created solutions. The instructions were accompanied by room for improvisation. The manual was a reference, not a prison, and that overturned the last advantage the German army still believed it had: predictability. In the German military tradition, precision was a virtue. Operations were designed weeks in advance. Supply lines were tightly controlled. Adaptation, while possible, was costly. It required approvals, redistribution of media, vertical communication. The Americans did not play this game. They invented the new board every morning. If one depot was bombed, another was set up the next day 10 kilometers away. If a bridge fell, engineers rebuilt it, or created a bypass through rough terrain. If the radios failed, they reverted to manual signals. Nothing stopped. Nothing needed to be perfect. It just needed to work, and work fast. This anarchic behavior in German eyes confused even intelligence analysts. German field reports were beginning to reflect this desperation. In a document seized in Aachen, an officer writes, "They change their position before we can fix them on maps." It was the collapse of control. The logic of the blitzkrieg, based on the anticipation of enemy movement, became useless. Because you can't anticipate the unpredictable, it is at this moment that the statistics reveal their hardest blow. While Germany produced, throughout 1944, just over 88,000 military trucks, the United States produced more than 700,000 in the same period. To repeat, 700,000 trucks, a difference of 8 to 1. If you were surprised by this number, comment below with "Logistics wins," because for Germans this disparity wasn't just humiliating, it was incomprehensible. It was like facing an enemy who was creating roads with the same speed as the tanks were advancing. The capacity for logistical mutation did not stop at the physical structure. She was human. Transport units were allowed to create their own decision cells. A lieutenant on the road could take action that, in other armed forces, would require sanction from a general. The hierarchy was compressed. Autonomy, high. A military system that seemed disorganized on the outside worked with the agility of a neural network on the inside. Each node was capable of acting. And the most fascinating thing, this was not improvised. It was designed. Elasticity was part of the original plan. Red Ball was not a rigid runner. It was a pulsating artery with infinite ramifications. On the German side, astonishment turned to frustration. No ambush stopped the flow. No sabotage had a lasting effect. No prediction matched reality. The sense of control disappeared. The Americans had become an intangible enemy, not by silence, but by insistence, not for precision, but for abundance, and the most painful, for the freedom to act. But the most shocking data was yet to come, because while the German generals were trying to understand how the Americans filled so many tanks, they didn't know that behind the surface, the trains, the grease, the gasoline, there was an even quieter machine, a prediction factory, where spreadsheets decided battles, and where the war was won even before the first shot. As German generals wore themselves out trying to predict convoy routes and estimate American inventories based on observed trucks, something deeper was happening before their eyes, or rather under the sea. It was Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, an engineering feat that seemed like fiction. Also during the preparations for D-Day, British and American engineers had designed and installed undersea pipelines across the English Channel, directly connecting England to northern France. Fuel didn't just come by ships or drums. It flowed, literally, underwater, in a constant, invisible, uninterrupted flow. It was the kind of solution that the Germans had not even imagined possible. Flexible pipelines, designed to withstand pressure and maritime movement, carried gasoline from the British coast to Cherbourg, and then branched out into an underground web that advanced with the troops, supplying mobile depots installed every 25 kilometers. It was the opposite of what was taught in military academies. One did not wait for the advance to assemble the rear guard. The rear guard went along with the advance. These warehouses were discreet, protected by maintenance units and secondary logistics networks. A tanker truck could fill its reservoirs in minutes and drive straight to the front. In many stretches, these trucks circulated alongside the ammunition convoys, with clear orders, top priority. The doctrine was simple. Without fuel, there is no mobility. Without mobility, there is no blitz. And without blitz, Patton is not Patton. Americans understood this long before their enemies. Therefore, they have reorganized their logistics system around an operational truth. Every tank must be ready to refuel in a maximum of 10 minutes. This was not an ambition. It was a pattern, and it was fulfilled. This fluidity of supply caused confusion even among the Allied troops. British soldiers reported incredulity at seeing fuel stations being set up in newly liberated villages, often even before the fighting ended. It was as if the engineers had secret maps of the future. In part, they did. American logistical forecasting did not work with improvisation, but with projection. Based on statistical models developed in the United States, some of them derived from academic research done before the war, supply units were able to accurately calculate where and when a new supply point would need to be installed. They were rudimentary but functional algorithms, and, more importantly, they were connected to an industrial production ecosystem that sustained them flawlessly. Germany at this time was desperately trying to protect its refineries. Allied bombing had decimated synthetic fuel production. The Luftwaffe suffered from a kerosene shortage. The armored divisions were paralyzed not by combat losses, but by lack of diesel. Meanwhile, the United States operated with surpluses. In just 1 week of operation, Pluto's pipelines were carrying more than 1 million gallons of gasoline. It was more than the whole of Germany could produce in the same period. And that was just the beginning. The system expanded every week, connecting new lines, feeding warehouses, anticipating advances. The American war did not need to wait for ships, nor to rely on convoys that were vulnerable to the weather or the enemy. It ran underground, literally. The Germans were slow to discover the existence of Pluto. When they finally captured documents and testimonies that revealed the system, the reaction was not strategic, it was symbolic. There was no way to sabotage something that was already deeply rooted and protected. And more, there was no possible answer, because the enemy, at that point, was no longer an army. It was a system, an industrial civilization on the march, a technical and human apparatus that combined oil, calculation, steel, and speed as parts of a single weapon, an invisible but ubiquitous weapon. And this weapon, now, fed more than tanks. It fed aircraft, field kitchens, heating systems, mobile workshops, medical units, and above all, the very spirit of continuity of the offensive. While Germany squeezed every liter of fuel with centralized control, the United States lavished mobility. The difference between them was not only one of power, it was a paradigm. But the most profound impact of Operation Pluto was not in the tubes, it was in time. Because while the Germans were still drawing lines on maps trying to guess where the Americans stored fuel, the Americans had already created the means to transport liquid gasoline at 60 km/h in thousands of directions, with surgical precision. And that's where the real ideological collapse happens. A German officer captured after the fall of Nancy was asked about the American advance. His answer was simple: they don't fight for territory, they fight for continuity. But there was one detail that even he didn't know. Because behind the pipes and tanks there was a factory on American soil producing yet another secret. A light, fast, adaptable vehicle. One that didn't need armor, because its defense was speed. It was the most unlikely vehicle of the war, and it was about to become the symbol of the Red Ball Express. German tanks, once the symbol of lightning warfare, now lay motionless in the forests and hills of France. Many were still operational, but without fuel, ammunition, or clear orders, they became metallic shadows of a recent past. Meanwhile, soldiers at the outposts, surrounded by uncertainty, hunger, and exhaustion, have come to live with a new kind of wonder. Sound. Not the sound of the bombs, nor the shots, but the persistent, uninterrupted sound of the American engine, the deep and rhythmic rumble of the Red Ball Express trucks. It started at night like a distant hum, then grew, gained strength, took over the valley, reverberated on the walls of abandoned houses, and when it finally passed, it didn't leave silence. It left resonance, because even when there were no trains, many German soldiers swore to listen to them. "It's as if the ground breathes under our boots," wrote a corporal in the 12th SS Division. He was not alone. Oberkommando's own intelligence reports described what they called the prolonged psychoacoustic effect, the constant impression that Americans were always moving, always fueling, always ready. It was more than hearing disturbance. It was psychological destruction. German military doctrine valued silence as preparation for the storm, but the Americans have inverted this axiom. Its noise was the storm itself. The illuminated columns which tore through the darkness of the French night with high beams, reflective signs, and sporadic horns became a spectacle of logistical domination. Even unintentionally, they created a living propaganda, a visible march of abundance. For the German soldier, every truck that passed meant ammunition, food, reinforcement, continuity. And with thousands passing by every day, the feeling was one of helplessness. How to face an enemy that shows itself like this? How to stop a system that not only advances but shows off? Captured prisoners reported episodes of hallucination. One of them, questioned after the fall of Le Havre, said he had listened to convoys for more than 48 hours straight, even when his position was isolated, with no visual contact with any road. Another reported that he began to confuse the sound of the engines with that of artillery at a distance, developing chronic insomnia. And there were even more extreme cases. Soldiers shooting at shadows, believing that they saw train lights where there was only fog. The sound of American logistics had become a night terror, invisible, but incontestable. It was the sonic embodiment of what the Germans could no longer achieve. Constant movement, endless supply, irreversible dominance. Senior officers tried to maintain discipline. They ordered the blocking of routes, the destruction of bridges, and the ambush of columns. But the results were always the same: irrelevant tactical losses. The flow continued. American losses were absorbed by redundancy. For each truck lost, two replaced it. With each bridge knocked down, another was built. It was like fighting a river. And the sound of this rushing river night and day eroded the Wehrmacht's morale more effectively than any armored offensive. In an undeliverable letter, found in the pocket of an officer killed in the Ardennes, there was a passage that summed up the feeling of that period. "I fear trucks more than tanks. They come before, they come after, and they never stop." This confession, written in an almost lyrical tone, revealed a truth that Nazi strategists could no longer hide. The enemy had won the war of presence. It was no longer a question of territory or position. It was a matter of permanence, of insistence, of ubiquity. The trucks did not shoot. They did not conquer cities. They did not fly flags. But they were what kept all this possible. And in doing so with such regularity, they became the symbol of a force that no longer needed to prove its superiority. It was enough to exist. It was enough to follow. It was enough to be heard. Because now, the sound of American engines wasn't just a logistical noise. It was the bell of surrender that hadn't yet been signed. But the war of perception still had one more chapter. Because even under this acoustic domain there was something that the Germans still did not understand. American logistics was not just technical, it was cultural, and at the heart of this system, there was a spirit that no statistics could explain. A spirit forged not in factories but on the roads, and that now took shape in a light, unprotected, noisy vehicle, but impossible to stop. The front was freezing under the snow of the Ardennes, when the German High Command, in a desperate attempt to reverse the logistical collapse, tried what it had ridiculed months earlier, create its own Red Ball Express. The name did not exist, but the intention was clear. With the Battle of the Bulge offensive underway, the panzer divisions required supplies at a steady pace: fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts. The idea was simple: capture Allied trucks, form convoys, and supply the spearheads as fast as the American supplied Patton. But the execution revealed something that could not be imported: doctrine. The German army, a master of detailed planning and hierarchical obedience, stumbled exactly where the American thrived: on improvisation. In the first 48 hours of the offensive, the Germans captured more than 200 American trucks, many of them abandoned during the Allied retreat. Equipped with fuel and food, they seemed like a gift from fate, but they soon became a burden. The engines, unknown to German mechanics, had simple flaws that could not be solved with local parts. The manuals were in English. The ignition systems were different. The valves did not fit with standard Wehrmacht tools. And more critically, German drivers, trained to follow orders with surgical precision, could not operate under the same autonomy regime required by the American model. Where the American sergeant would decide in minutes how to get around a blockade, the German sergeant would await instructions from the upper echelon. This cultural difference was lethal. In a secret report from the 5th Panzer Armee, one officer wrote, "We have trucks, we have drivers, but we don't have a system." What was missing was not iron. It was philosophy. The American war had been shaped to accept error as part of the process. The doctrine was adaptive. Supply officers had freedom of action. Drivers had the authority to choose secondary routes, go around villages, improvise bridges with local wood. The Germans, on the other hand, expected authorization for every deviation, every change, every movement outside the plan. The chain of command, efficient for conventional battles, paralyzed mobile logistics. A simple traffic jam required consultation with the tactical command. And while the phone was being activated, time, this new enemy, won. The failure was so visible that senior officers themselves began to question the structure. Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, noted with bitterness the paradox. The doctrine that had vanquished Poland, France, and paralyzed the Soviet Union in 1941 was now becoming obsolete in the face of an enemy who was not afraid of error. The rapid warfare model depended on accuracy, but now the field required flexibility. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a line of trucks, it was a decentralized doctrine in motion, and this, for the German spirit, was impossible to replicate. Even when they tried to organize logistical columns using their own vehicles, the results were disastrous. Fuel shortages, already critical, have made each train a risky bet. The lack of parts caused 1 in 3 trucks to break down after a few days, and the convoys, exposed on Belgian roads, became easy targets for Allied fighters. Air raids cut through the German supply line like invisible blades. There was no way to answer. With no air control, no flexibility, and no viable alternatives, the columns disintegrated before reaching their destination. What the Americans did with corporals and sergeants, the Germans demanded colonels and generals. Logistics had changed in scale and in nature. The collapse was evident when, at the height of the offensive, German armored divisions simply stopped, not because of Allied resistance, but because of a lack of gasoline. Cutting-edge tanks, such as the Panther and Tiger, were stranded on the icy roads, while entire convoys returned empty, or not at all. The enemy, who had moved with millimetric perfection during the first years of the war, now found himself immobilized, not by force but by structure. The attempt to copy the Red Ball Express not only failed, it exposed the fragility of a system that did not know how to evolve. The cruelest comparison did not come from the Americans. It came from the German prisoners themselves. A major captured at Bastogne stated, "They treat the war as enterprise. We still treat it as art." The phrase, although melancholy, explained everything. American efficiency was industrial, corporate, operational. The strength came from the volume, yes, but also from the permission to make mistakes, try, correct, and continue. And that freedom, rooted in the spirit of a society driven by innovation and speed, couldn't be taught in a week, nor captured with a truck. But there was one fact that the Germans still did not know, because while they tried to emulate American improvisation, they didn't know that Patton's next move was already underway, and he didn't need a map, because the path had already been paved by thousands of tires. And now, the next city already had a name: Metz. The Red Ball Express trains didn't just win by volume and speed, they won by symbol. On the narrow roads of devastated France, what German soldiers came to see with increasing frequency were not just trucks, but African-American drivers leading supply columns, driving vehicles at high speed, making decisions under fire, and assuming logistical command positions. These were men who, under the laws of their own nation, could not go to the same restaurants or bathrooms as their white counterparts. But there, on the war roads, they had the power to decide on routes, deadlines, and priorities. And that, more than any Allied armored vehicle, was something that Nazi ideology didn't know how to process. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich, so efficient in ridiculing the Allies, suddenly fell silent on the logistical issue. There were no more cartoons caricaturing American disorder. In its place, silence, a revealing silence. Because admitting the Red Ball Express to work required acknowledging that black soldiers, the same ones Hitler had classified as subhuman, were not only contributing to the Allied victory, but leading the most decisive cog in the campaign, the supply line. Racial supremacy, the ideological pillar of Nazism, began to crumble not by speeches or treaties, but by horns and tires. In interrogations conducted by the Allies, several German prisoners expressed incredulity when they learned that many of the logistical convoys were led by African Americans. One of them, a Luftwaffe officer, recorded in a statement, "It's impossible. A black man cannot command a military column." The officer was confronted with photos, maps, reports, and the silence that followed was more eloquent than any confession. Another prisoner, captured at Nancy, remarked with bewilderment that the convoys worked with Prussian efficiency, but with faces we would never see in a war academy. The dissonance between belief and fact was absolute. Pause for a fact. By the end of the campaign in France, it was estimated that more than 75% of all Red Ball Express drivers were African American. There were more than 17,000 soldiers, moving 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days, more than 20,000 trips per week. The logistics of victory, conducted by men who could not even vote in their own country. If this statistic surprised you, comment below with a phrase like absolute power or logistics wins. Because behind each piece of data, there is a historical irony that needs to be remembered. The black sergeants who led these columns not only knew the routes, the volumes, and the estimated times. They created routes. They improvised solutions. They trained inexperienced drivers. They dealt with attacks, sabotage, mechanical outages, disease, exhaustion, and prejudice, all while maintaining the cadence of the supply line. The most advanced army in modern history at that time was fueled by a force that its own society had not yet been able to recognize. The contradiction was untenable for both sides. Inside the Nazi machine, records on American logistics disappeared from SS military magazines from September 1944. The reason was simple. Showing trains running implied showing who drove them, and that didn't fit the narrative. In the United States, racial divisions remained rigid, even in the face of the unequivocal contribution of these soldiers. Many Red Ball Express drivers would return home without decorations, without public recognition, without access to the rights they had fought for. The moral victory was silent, but real. The irony wasn't just political, it was operational. The Germans, in trying to replicate American logistics, failed to understand what moved that system. It wasn't just oil or steel, it was spirit. It was distributed autonomy. It was the ability to make decisions on the field. And this African American soldiers did masterfully, even when the world insisted on ignoring them. There is something deeply symbolic about the fact that Patton's tanks only advanced because voiceless men pushed tons of fuel and ammunition up the coasts of Europe every day. The American Blitz was black. It was invisible. It was audible only by the sound of the engine. And even this sound, as we have seen, caused more terror than the crack of a rifle. A German general, in his memoirs written after the war, admitted, We did not understand the war they were fighting. While we defended honor, they delivered supplies. He didn't mean it as a criticism. I meant as a statement. The American war was logistical. It was quantity. It was insistence. And above all, it was done by everyone, including those whom the enemy refused to see as soldiers. But there was still one last invisible engine in this machine, something that was not on the roads, nor on the trains, nor on the trucks. It was in the ocean, and now it crossed the Atlantic every minute, moving the impossible in the direction of victory. When the military planners of the Third Reich calculated victory, they looked to the Panther, the Tiger, the Messerschmitt. They saw power, range, armor, refined engineering. And indeed, these machines were technological milestones. But while the Germans drew the war with curves of mechanical precision, the Americans drew in straight lines, long, resistant, patterned. They were not looking for the perfect vehicle. They were looking for the possible, replicable, field-repairable vehicle, stocked with swappable parts. The result? A machine called GMC CCKW, known to the troops as the Duke and a Half. This, too, 5-ton truck did not impress at first glance. But that was exactly what made him invincible. It was common. And in war, the common, on an industrial scale, destroys the extraordinary. The Germans produced, over the course of the war, about 100,000 tanks, trucks, and military vehicles combined. The United States produced 500,000 CCKWs. This model alone exceeded the sum total of the Wehrmacht's motorized fleet. And they did not come alone. Each truck was part of a system. Broken tow tractors, mobile cranes for cargo extraction, mobile workshops with interchangeable tools, standardized technical manual, even for inexperienced drivers. The truck was just the visible tip of a chain that involved factories, ports, vessels, warehouses, and maintenance troops. It was an organism, not a part. While the Germans had to dismantle entire engines to repair damage, the Americans swapped out entire blocks. If a differential had a problem, it was replaced in less than an hour. If a truck lost a wheel, it was replaced with a simple turn of the key. What if the truck broke down irretrievably? It was left, because another one was already on the way. The goal was not to preserve the machine. It was to keep the flow. Germany built relics. The United States built streams. And this current drowned the enemy's calculations. A standard Red Ball express train operated with about 50 to 60 CCKWs. In a single day, more than 6,000 circulated on French roads, more than 120,000 tires in motion, more than 700,000 gallons of gasoline transported. The Tiger, the ultimate symbol of Nazi military engineering, was superior to any American armored vehicle in direct combat. But it required more than 100 liters of fuel per hour, tailor-made parts, and constant maintenance. The CCKW, on the other hand, ran 10 hours a day, loaded with half that, and could be repaired by a soldier with a wrench and a manual. In the end, what moved the war was not the power per vehicle but the permanence of the system. In American doctrine, the tank was the tip of the spear, but the truck was the arm. And without an arm, there is no way to hold the spear. This strategic vision, based on redundancy and scalability, reflected the industrial culture of the United States, a country where factories were designed to never stop, where scarcity was fought with reverse planning, where each piece was born with its replacement in production, and where the priority was not aesthetic excellence but functional effectiveness. In contrast, the German industrial park, even highly sophisticated, operated with clear boundaries, bombed, hastily decentralized, fragmented by political and racial decisions. The Reich factory system could not sustain the war of attrition. It produced killing machines, but not sustaining systems. There was a lack of parts, fuel, lubricants, and there was a lack of time. When they tried to keep tanks running for more than 10 consecutive days, the failure rate exceeded 40%. The CCKWs, on the other hand, ran for weeks with light maintenance, and if they broke, they were replaced, like parts on a living production line. This contrast reached its apex in the fall of 1944. While the Panzergruppes retreated due to lack of mobility, Patton's forces advanced, not because they are better at direct combat, but because they are always supplied, always mobile, always fueling. The speed of the American offensive was logistical, not tactical, And so the German generals began to change their tune. Instead of discussing positions or brigades, they began to cite the flow of supplies as a decisive factor in the defeat. A captured report from the 11th Panzer Division reads, "Trucks are the new American artillery," a phrase that sums up the century. Pause for a number that the Germans never imagined. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. produced more than 2.3 million military trucks. This means that, on average, a new truck left the factory every 3 minutes, a number that makes any enemy planning obsolete. If you were surprised by this statistic, write in the comments a phrase like "shocking data" or "logistics wins," because this war was won more on the steering wheel than on the trigger. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is not in the numbers, but in the symbol. While Nazi propaganda extolled the tank as the pinnacle of warlike virility, what decided the war was a gray truck, without armor, without armament, but with a twin-axle, 6-wheel drive and an engine that simply wouldn't stop. He was the one who brought ammunition to the battlefields, who brought the wounded back, who kept Patton moving, who fueled the advance, and who silently broke the back of the Nazi war machine. But the machine was not yet completely defeated, because now, with winter approaching, everyone's eyes were on Germany, and what would come next would require something even bigger than trucks. It would require bridges that did not exist, still. The Red Ball Express was designed to fuel Patton's advance, but what he activated was a chain reaction that would change the entire theater of the war. The impact of thousands of trucks crisscrossing France 24 hours a day was more profound than any Allied planner had anticipated. By ensuring constant mobility for the armored forces, the system not only allowed for the encirclement and subsequent liberation of Paris, it accelerated the entire strategic calendar of the Western Front. Each kilometer conquered with supplies delivered on time represented weeks less of combat. And in a conflict that had dragged on for 5 years, weeks were worth thousands of lives. With Paris liberated in August 1944, long before initial projections, the Allied offensive gained a new lease of life. The Rhine Line, once considered an obstacle for 1945, became a viable goal in a matter of months. Plans for a protracted war in the European winter were adjusted. American logistics, operating with redundancy and aggressiveness, shortened the war by at least 6 months, according to estimates by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Allies itself. And this strategic gain was not achieved by tanks, but by trucks. Every kilometer paved, every ton of ration delivered, every drum of gasoline dumped on the back of a Sherman brought the end of the war closer, and the Germans knew. But Red Ball Express didn't just transform war maps, it transformed hearts as well. In the wake of the convoys that roared through the roads of a devastated France came signs of another world. Canned food with chocolate and instant coffee, cigarettes in shiny packs, soaps, brushes, toilet paper, trivial things for an American soldier, but symbols of civilization for a population that had lived for years under rationing, fear, and propaganda. The children ran after the trucks shouting, "Chocolate! Chocolate!" Families waved from the windows with white handkerchiefs. And the Germans, looking at everything, saw not just an army on the move, but a culture. Nazi propaganda, built on the figure of the barbaric and decadent invader, did not resist the first convoy. The image of the disorganized, morally weak, and racially degenerate American soldier crumbled before a smiling, grease-smeared driver who threw candy and soap out of the window. It was impossible to sustain the myth of Aryan superiority in the face of unstoppable supply columns, not even at night, not even under fire. The logistical collapse was also the symbolic collapse of the Reich. Where the American flag passed, terror gave way to curiosity. Where the engines roared, civilian hope resurfaced. The French resistance, which had been fighting for years with precarious means, began to receive food, weapons, and medicine on a regular basis. In many villages, the convoys were the first tangible evidence that liberation was real. They were not preceded by speeches or pamphlets. They were preceded by smoke, oil, and snoring. And they left behind a trail of more than tires. They left the feeling that the war could end, and that it would be defeated not by an ideology, but by a system. Meanwhile, German generals watched the board lose cohesion. Their divisions retreated faster than they could be replenished. His radio messages were filled with logistical urgency, lack of fuel, lack of ammunition, lack of mobility. In contrast, American forces began to rotate units not out of exhaustion, but out of calendar. Abundance allowed for planning. Predictability, previously impossible, became standard, and this stability undermined enemy morale as much as any defeat in the open. The Red Ball Express, then, was no longer just a transport operation. He became a symbol of a war waged with a different mentality, a war where efficiency was not achieved by absolute discipline, but by controlled freedom, where victory was not a matter of honor, but of surrender, where total war, so proclaimed by Goebbels, was won not by terror, but by constancy. A letter captured in Metz, written by a German officer to the High Command, bore the following sentence: "They do not stop, even when we destroy the road, even when it rains, even at night. The trains come back." That was the difference. The trucks knew no rest. And with them came provisions, soldiers, hope, and the psychological weight of an enemy that seemed to recognize no obstacles. The strategic, moral, and symbolic impact of the Red Ball Express did not stop at the front line. It reverberated in every liberated city, in every bridge rebuilt, in every child who received a packet of gum. It was a victory that was measured in tons and in smiles. A victory that was not only on the beaches of Normandy, but in the fields, on the roads, and in the hearts that believed again. But the war was not yet over, and now the eyes of the Allies were on the industrial heart of the Reich. Crossing the Rhine would require more than speed. It would require traversing obstacles that even trucks could not overcome alone. It was time for military engineering to step in, with bridges that would defy physics, logic, and time. The winter of 1944 arrived as a new front. The battlefront was not only moving against German defenses, it was now fighting against nature. Sub-zero temperatures, roads turned into rivers of frozen mud, gusts of wind that cut through the skin, and nights so dark that even the headlights seemed to disappear into the void. It was the kind of scenario that German doctrine considered definitive. It was believed that no logistics operation based on tires and combustion engines could survive the rigor of the European winter. The Russian past bore it out. Not even the Wehrmacht had been able to keep supplies flowing under those conditions. Logic once again said that Patton would stop, but logic once again did not know the Red Ball Express. At each frozen turn, the Americans improvised. Heavy chains were installed on the tires to pull on the ice. Radiators were given ethanol mixtures to prevent the fluids from freezing. Cabins were insulated with blankets, grease, and layers of cardboard. Some drivers operated with the windows open, facing biting winds, just to avoid fogging up the windows. Others taped their eyelids so they wouldn't fall asleep at the wheel. Many drove 36 hours straight without stopping, taking turns only when they physically collapsed. The irony of this story is that the solution lay in front of them, ordinary men with unusual resistance. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and rediscovering the forgotten details of victory, like and subscribe. Your support allows us to continue bringing these silent gears of history to the fore. Meanwhile, the Germans watched without understanding. The routes should be impassable. The columns should have stopped, but the trains passed by. Slowly, covered in ice, engines roaring at a lower frequency, but still, passed, by forests, through villages buried in snow, by improvised wooden bridges. The logistical flow, although reduced, has never ceased, and this technical detail, continuity, was what sustained American divisions during the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. As Hitler's forces prepared their last major offensive, believing that American logistics would collapse, the answer came in the form of trucks. Trucks carrying rations, thermal clothing, ammunition, fuel. Trucks that faced what no military manual recommended. It was, once again, a war won not only by numbers but by decision, because the driver who pulled his vehicle out of the ditch in the middle of a blizzard was not following an order. He was following a purpose. In the rear, engineering crews cleared roads with explosives. They cut down trees to free passage. They set up mobile workshops heated with oil stoves. The entire structure of the Red Ball Express was adapted to the cold. What was fast in the summer became resilient in the winter, and if in August the convoys traveled up to 100 kilometers a day, in December they traveled only 40, but with the same constancy. The advance slowed down, but never stopped. And that was enough to keep the battlefront alive. The difference was philosophical. The Germans believed in perfect systems that collapsed in the face of exception. Americans believed in adaptive systems that survived chaos. One operated under absolute control, the other under full pressure. And winter, as a scenario, was the definitive laboratory of this difference. An account of a German prisoner captured at Bastogne describes the incredulity of the troops when they saw American trucks trying to cross completely frozen roads. "They move as if they don't know they are surrounded," he wrote. But it was not ignorance. It was a silent doctrine that said, as long as a truck can move, the war continues. And she would continue, because the next obstacle was already on the horizon. It wasn't the weather, nor the distance. It was the largest river in Europe, and to cross it, it would take more than courage. It would be necessary to build bridges that would challenge the impossible. The war required rapid change, but no change has been as abrupt, and at the same time as quiet, as the deactivation of the Red Ball Express. After 82 days of uninterrupted operation, 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day, 23,000 drivers crossing France from west to east, the railway was finally back in operation. The bombed tracks had been repaired. The trains were ready to resume mass transit, and with a simple dispatch from the High Command, what was the largest mobile land logistics operation in history was shut down within 72 hours. Quietly, no dramatic transition. The convoys stopped, the drivers were relocated, the stations dismantled. What the Germans would have taken months to convert, the Americans disabled in 3 days. Because the operation was not an end in itself, it was a bridge. A means to keep the advance until another more efficient system took over. The greatness of the Red Ball Express lay not only in its scale, but in its temporariness. It was a living creature, with a programmed beginning, middle, and end. No bureaucracy, no institutional resistance. It was industrial warfare elevated to its most fluid form. The structure was dismantled with the same rigor with which it had been created. Temporary warehouses were emptied, checkpoints disabled, military traffic officers redeployed, trucks rerouted to new functions, transporting prisoners, refugees, fuel. What was a massive system, operating with millimeter precision, simply disappeared from the landscape. And perhaps this was his most underrated feat, not only to function under pressure, but to know how to disappear gracefully. American logistical doctrine did not cling to the glory of an operation. She closed it when necessary, without nostalgia, without monument. Efficiency had no vanity. Meanwhile, the Germans, cornered, were still trying to regroup their logistical forces around the Rhine. But the cultural difference was stark. Every German supply center required defense, order, rigid authority. When disassembled, it generated confusion. Americans, by contrast, operated with a modular mindset. Each piece was useful for a while, and then replaced. Each route existed as long as it was advantageous. Every decision was adaptable. This generated an organizational velocity that no centralized structure could keep up with. War was now no longer about what you possessed, but about what you could move. The Red Ball Express's speed of demobilization was, in itself, a weapon. It freed up routes for new operations. It freed up personnel for new fronts. And more than that, he sent a message. If the Americans could set up a logistical network of continental proportions, and then dismantle it as if it were a tent, what else could they do? The war was not yet over, and Berlin was ahead. A Wehrmacht engineer, captured in the Koblenz region, expressed his bewilderment in an interrogation. "We don't understand how they disappear. Where did the trains stop? Yesterday there were hundreds. Today there is none. They don't make sense to us." That was the question. The Red Ball Express was not made to make sense within the Germanic logic. It was made to work, to exist as long as it was necessary, and to disappear when the mission was accomplished. The dissolution of the war's largest mobile supply line did not represent the end of his influence. On the contrary, the principles learned there, decentralization, disciplined improvisation, operational redundancy, became a model for future operations. Korea, Vietnam, Middle East. Whenever the road was more important than the base, the spirit of Red Ball would turn its engines again. And for the German generals, the ultimate humiliation was not defeat on the field. It was realizing that they did not even know where the war had really been won, because it was not only won in battles. It was won in spreadsheets, deposits, routes, and clutches. It was won by men soiled with oil and grease, who needed no medals, only maps and gasoline. And while they were still calculating how to react, the Americans had already finished, and they were ready for the next step, a step that would not come on the rails, but by movable bridges floating over Europe's largest river. In 1945, while the last shots echoed over European soil, a silent transformation was taking hold in military circles around the world. The old doctrines based on bravery, chivalry, and maneuver were still engraved in the textbooks, but they no longer dictated the outcome of wars. Clausewitz was still red, but Detroit had won. For the first time in history, victory was not attributed to numerical superiority, nor to the genius of a commander, but to the capacity of supply. And at the center of this doctrinal revolution was the Red Ball Express, the system that the Germans underestimated, that many allies did not understand at first, became a model of study, not for its tactical elegance, but for its brutal functionality. It was the consecration of war as a product of industrial organization. In interrogations conducted at the end of the conflict, German officials summed up the collapse in a few words. We lost to the trucks. We lost to time. We lost to the flow. The blitzkrieg, which had once shocked the world with its speed, had been overcome by an even faster force, because it was constant, a supply line with its own engine, its own agenda, and its own morale. The Red Ball Express was not an accessory of the American offensive. It was the offensive itself. In the following years, the General Staff Courses of France, the United Kingdom, and the USSR included Red Ball in their curricula, not as a curiosity, but as a doctrine. It represented a new kind of power, the power that didn't have to shoot to win. The textbooks began to repeat a maxim that, until then, was only a footnote. Logistics wins war before combat. At West Point, American officers began to repeat coldly that no bullet reaches the enemy if it does not have fuel, food, and wheels. The mentality has changed. The invisible front, hitherto ignored, gained prestige. The function of quartermaster, previously despised, became one of the most disputed among cadets, because the world had learned modern warfare was won by whoever kept the engine running the longest. And there's a brutal difference between keeping the engine running and keep it moving under fire, mud, snow, and miles of road. This was something the Germans were unable to replicate, because its doctrine was closed, its logistical system centralized, its military culture based on rigidity. Red Ball Express was born precisely from the denial of these premises. He flourished in chaos because he was made to live within him. There was no perfection. There was adaptation. There was no ideal plan. There was constant correction. And this operational philosophy proved superior to any idealization of mobile warfare. General Omar Bradley would later say, "We didn't win because we were smarter. We won because we could keep moving." And George Patton, who lived off speed, was even more blunt. "Give me fuel and I'll break hell." Red Ball not only gave this fuel, it delivered it by appointment, even when hell was frozen. Interestingly, there were no military stops for the drivers. There were no parades for the trains, but behind the scenes the generals knew, without them, nothing would have advanced. The artillery would be mute. The infantry stopped. The tanks, immobile. That is why war manuals, think tanks, and even NATO planners have recognized Red Ball was the operation that redefined the 20th century. It was about keeping it supplied. And by studying every curve, every route, every day without fail, the real lesson is born. It is not heroism that sustains war. It's the delivery, and no army has delivered so much for so long, with such speed. But there is still one last piece to complete the picture. Because after all this efficiency, there was something that the Germans couldn't measure, something that no statistics can explain, the soul behind the gear. And that's what we'll see in the next part. When the Red Ball Express engines finally went quiet, his story didn't end. She just changed course. From the frozen fields of Normandy to the plains of the United States, thousands of demobilized motorists returned home with something the war had given them without medals: experience. They were not generals, nor strategists, but they knew what it meant to keep a live load moving for hundreds of miles, under constant pressure. They knew how to improvise routes, predict mechanical failures, lead convoys, and operate under extreme conditions. They had experienced logistics as combat, and they came back ready to transform the civilian world with the same quiet discipline that won the Reich. The history of modern logistics, the global supply chain, the road culture of the United States. It starts there, in the trucks that kept Patton moving. Some of these veterans founded companies that today would be classified as startups. Others joined nascent transport corporations that saw war expertise as a strategic advantage. Yellow Freight System, which would later become a mainstay of interstate transportation, employed dozens of former Red Ball drivers. Consolidated freightways grew using routing and maintenance methods learned in occupied France. What the front taught, the market absorbed. Predictability, cadence, adaptation. For the first time, trucks were not just vehicles. They were vectors of a new era. But it was not only the private sector that benefited. The American government itself, impressed by the achievements of the operation, consulted Red Ball veterans to design the interstate highway system, approved in 1956. Dwight Eisenhower, then president, had seen for himself what it meant to depend on improvised routes on European soil. To avoid this risk on American soil, military infrastructure was needed that would also serve the economy. The doctrine of rapid displacement, tested in war, became public policy in peacetime, and the U.S. road network began to be planned as if Red Ball were still in operation, only now with civilian cargo. From a technical point of view, the Red Ball trains anticipated concepts that would only gain a name decades later. Just-in-time, lean logistics, fleet tracking, real-time traffic control, all of these already existed, in essence, in the muddy stretches of France in 1944. The schedule was tight, delivery windows short, maintenance control is constant. The engineering units were equivalent to modern supply chain teams. Each stop was a hub, each route a logistics corridor, every train an integrated supply chain in motion. The war taught and the corporate world listened, and there was more. The coexistence between drivers, mechanics, guides, and officers, many of them coming from segregated realities, also left social marks. The companies that emerged after the conflict, led by African-American ex-servicemen, broke down invisible barriers in the American economy. They founded transport companies, garages, maintenance networks, and technical schools. They didn't ask for space. They won it by the competence demonstrated with 5 tons of cargo on wheels. The freedom they did not find in segregated gas stations, they found in the autonomy to found their own businesses. Red Ball, even unintentionally, had sown something more than logistics. It had created social mobility. Today, the term Red Ball is still used in U.S. military logistics circles to refer to urgent deliveries. At certain Air Force bases, when a shipment is considered a priority and vital to a mission, it is given the red mark. But few know that this expression was born from an operation carried out with improvised paint and metal plates nailed to the trucks, racing against time and the enemy. Few know that behind the delivery of a package via digital tracking, there is an ancestral line that passes through Nevers, Le Mans, Chartres, Reims, and it flows into the highways of California, Texas, and Pennsylvania. This is how the Red Ball Express survived. Not in museums, but in logistics warehouses. Not in the ceremonies bottom, but in the warehouses. Not in parades, but on the signs of the interstates. And as much as time covers your memory with the dust of routine, one fact remains. The world we live in today, accelerated, integrated, fueled, has been tested under fire and tasted on wheels. But even now, after all this, there is one question that echoes. Not on the battlefield, not in the supply sheets. A question asked by those who laughed first, and that they only understood in the end. How was it possible? How did an empire on wheels win the most mechanized war in history? The answer is close, and it does not come from a piece of data nor from a graph. She comes from the countryside. It comes from the face. It comes from the road. They laughed. They laughed at the noisy Americans, the disorderly trains, the naive belief that engines would beat machine guns. They laughed at the African Americans behind the wheel, at the improvised tactics, at the chalk-drawn routes on oil-stained maps. Laughed until the tanks stood still, until the ammunition ran out, until the sound of U.S. engines crossed French villages, German fields, and the very soul of an army that thought itself invincible. The collapse did not come with bombings. It came with deliveries. While the panzer divisions begged for fuel and parts, the Red Ball Express delivered everything every day by appointment. In the end, the war that began with myths of superiority ended with a tactical silence, interrupted only by the constant roar of 6,000 trucks. The Third Reich, molded in steel and pride, fell before rubber tires and logistical tables. What the German generals called American excess was actually the new way to win: strategic abundance. And that's the great lesson of modern warfare, a lesson written not in treaties but in Greece. In the industrial age, strategy follows logistics. The best armored division in the world is worth less than the gasoline that powers it. The most beautiful tactical doctrine fails in the face of a gear that does not stop. The Red Ball Express taught future planners that you don't just win with precision, you win with volume, rhythm, and constant adaptation. While German doctrine stalled under the weight of its own rigidity, the Americans delivered flexibility on wheels. And at the end, a simple sentence, gleaned from a captured German military report, wraps it all up with the precision of a logistical obituary: we lost to the trucks. If you value serious research and the reconstruction of facts forgotten by history, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel. Your participation strengthens our mission to reveal what truly shaped the 20th century, away from the obvious heroes and close to the silent machinery that changed the course of war. Comment below, what was the most shocking fact of this story? And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating story, because this story may be over, but the next one is already on the way, and it starts not with tanks or planes, but with radios that picked up an impossible message. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.